Hello, everybody. It's that time of year again. New England Conservatory is up and running with its semester well underway, and the halls are full of music. And it's time for our first Monday season. I think it's number 37, but sometimes I lose track. Anyway, I want to tell you what's on my mind this year. Every year I try to put together things so that there's a kind of a theme or there's a kind of a connecting element to it. This time, I decided that the fall semester would be all French. Now, we've had plenty of French music over the years at various times at various parts of the programs, but never such an immersion as we're going to have this fall. I decided to do that because it seems like it needs focus and because we've not had that much of an aggregation of pieces and composers to bring together in a way that I think is very appealing for this fall. And we're going to start in the October program with the French Baroque, and we're going to end in December with the latest, well, one of the latest pieces by Henri Dutilleux, great late 20th century composer. And every composer is French or connected to France. So that's the basic idea, and I'll give you a little peek preview about the spring is all going to be about the 100th anniversary of the great composer George Ligeti. But I'll save comments about that for later. So where shall we begin? I decided that the best place to begin is with the French Baroque. The music that comes in that part of the world before then doesn't seem to know much about borders. It's mostly about the church. And so we have Dufay. Is he French? Is he Belgian? Is he Flemish? We're going to put that behind us and go directly to when French music really came together as a recognizable element in the world of the arts. The period that I'm going to talk about is roughly during the lifetime of the great Sun King, Louis XIV, Louis XIV. And he was born in 1638 and lived to 1715. And in that period of time, there was a great flowering of music. We're going to start by setting the stage a little bit for what we're going to hear today. And in order to do that, I have to talk to you about two composers who are very important to French music, neither of whom, surprisingly, is born in France. The first I'm going to talk about in terms of chronology is the person we know as Jean-Baptiste Lully. It sounds very French, but actually he was born in Florence, Italy, and he was Giovanni Battista Lully. That's a surprise to me when I found out about that. But his story about how he became French is kind of fun. He came from a family of musicians, and he was well along as a prodigy, I would say, when at the age of 14, a visiting French nobleman heard his music and decided to bring him to France. The nobleman had a couple of things on his mind. He was interested in Lully as a budding, wonderful talent. But the nobleman also had a daughter that he wanted to learn Italian. And so he thought the best way to pull all of this together was to bring Lully, who would teach his daughter Italian and then get on with his life as a musician. And because he was brought by a nobleman, he immediately was introduced and became knowledgeable about the upper class of French life and French interest in the arts. In fact, he was also a very good dancer. And it seems that actually the future king, Louis XIV, met Lully at some kind of an event where they were both dancing. Lully was almost immediately appointed to a musical role in the court of the king. 1 year later, 1662, Lully married a French woman. And at that point, he became a French citizen, and he changed his name from Giovanni Battista to Jean Baptiste, and that's how we know him. And so he was in France from the age of 14, and so I guess it's fine to call him a French composer. In all the period of his great and important activity as a performer and a composer, he wrote operas. He was very big on operas. He wrote a lot of instrumental works and also was involved with introducing dances to the French culture, dances we know the names of today, the gavotte and the sarabande and the minuet, that became court dances. And that actually, turning sideways, led to those dances coming together in suites that were known by composers like Bach as French suites. They were collections of dances, and it was Lully who started us down that road. So he had made a huge impact on the life of France and music. And we're not going to hear his music today, but it's important to our story. So the other Italian composer you need to know about is Arcangelo Corelli. Corelli was, if not the absolute first, the most important exponent of the violin as a solo instrument. And he spawned after him people like Vivaldi and Tartini and Locatelli, all of those Italian string players whose music is still played very often. Corelli was not born in Rome, but essentially he was Roman, and he worked for the church. And in that period of time, there were instrumental pieces played by one or two violins or a flute, and usually with a harpsichord as a continuo. And if they had 4 movements, they were called church sonatas, slow, fast, slow, fast. And if they were 3 movements, which was slow, fast, and maybe a minuet or something a little bit to end it with, they were called popular pieces. He was very good at both, but he really established that form of the trio sonata, which is what we call it, as a very dominant force in the history of music. And this is leaving behind a lot of great Italian composers like Monteverdi and Palestrina before. Palestrina is interesting because it was the kind of music that Palestrina believed in, a great choral composer, that where everything was melodic and structured, that was the big influence on Corelli. And that's most of what I need to tell you about Corelli, but you'll see how Lully and Corelli will come together in this program. So let's get into the program itself. The first piece on the program is by a figure that a lot of people don't know about unless you're in the Baroque area. And his name was Marais. And he was absolutely French. He was born in Paris, died in Paris, born in 1656, a little bit before Bach, and died in 1728. He had 2 important teachers. One of them was Lully, so let's try that, put that in already. And the thing that was very special about Marais was he was a player and a composer. And the instrument he played, you will now hear in Baroque settings, but not in modern music. It was called the viola da gamba. Gamba is the Italian word that means legs, and he held the instrument between his knees, and so he looked like a cellist playing, but the cello really came a little bit later. And he was a great virtuoso of that, and he ascribed his prowess on that to another teacher, Saint Colombe. He studied with him only for about 6 months, and that was a very intense time in which he really came to be the great player he was. And he wrote lots and lots of pieces for solo viola da gamba or gamba with other instruments. And the story of his relationship to Saint-Colombe is wonderfully told in a movie from, I think it's 1991. It was called Tous les matins du monde, which means all the mornings of the world. And it was about how this young man came to this teacher, and really the relationship between the two of them is the story. But the movie is also wonderfully augmented by performances of Marais' music. And that's very much to the credit of a great Catalan gamba player named Jordi Savall. So the first piece we're going to hear is a piece that Marais wrote, and it's called Sonnerie de Sainte-Geneviève du Mont de Paris. Now we're going to turn to the very famous French composer, François Couperin. Couperin, like Bach, we know a lot about, came from generations of musicians. Everybody in his family was a musician. And he was the greatest of them all. He was born in 1688 and died in 1733. That makes him almost an exact contemporary of Johann Sebastian Bach. He was first famous as an organist. His father was a very important organist at one of the churches in Paris, and he took over that job when his father died when he was barely a teenager. And then, of course, the center of musical life all revolved around the Sun King, Louis XIV. And so he was appointed a composer at the court of Louis XIV. And almost immediately it was clear what a great composer he was. And he was, I think the year after he went into the employment of the king, he was granted royal permission to publish all of his music. So he was first publishing music for organ, and then he broke out into all kinds of other ensembles. And he had a wonderful career in that period. And then late in his life, which, as I say, wasn't terribly long, he wasn't so well anymore, and he was really thinking about his heritage. And the two big names that were of interest to him, we've spoken about earlier in my talk. One was Corelli, and one was Lully, both Italian by birth. So how do you pay homage to somebody from behind? In those days, what you do is you try to elevate those composers to the level of the gods. And the word in English we speak about that is apotheosis. So the first of them that he wrote was in 1724, and it was an apotheosis of Corelli. Well, what did that mean? It goes back to Greek mythology. We've always, as musicians, been very fascinated by Apollo. He played the lyre. He was one connected to the Muses, and he was very connected to the Oracle of Delphi. Connected to Delphi was mention of this mountain near Delphi called Parnassus. If you were a god and you were up there on Parnassus, that was pretty high fame. So what Couperin had in mind was he wanted to create a piece that would tell about how Corelli had been elevated to Mount Parnassus. And the story of it is told in instruments, and very interestingly, in little short sections, each of which has a verbal description. Corelli is invited by Apollo to Parnassus. He sings a song. They welcome him. They whatever. Okay. But there was another thing on Couperin's mind. The fact was that French music was dance and in form quite different from the music of Corelli, which was very structured into trio sonatas and in music that seems familiar to us because that was very much adopted by Bach and other composers. So it was very important to Couperin that he wanted to reunite the tastes of Italy and France. And so by introducing an Italian composer to Parnassus, which is what the French thought was where all of the great French artists were, that he would make that happen. The other one he wanted to bring in, of course, was Lully, Italian-born but French. So what we're going to hear in this program is the apotheosis of Lully by Couperin for a group of Baroque instruments, and with the story being told from the stage of each step of the way. I know you'll enjoy it. So this program is in two parts, really, and we're starting with the French Baroque, and then we're going to the great glory of France, the composer Claude Debussy. Not the only one, but as big as they come in our estimation. Debussy was born in 1862 and lived a too short life. He died in 1918. We'll get to that a little bit later. And we all know the music of Debussy, his great tone poem, La Mer, the ocean, or his opera Pelées et Mélisande, and the various orchestral pieces he wrote, and preludes for piano, and all of that. So that I don't need to tell you too much about who he was. The one thing I will say is that after his very traditional beginning, he wrote a string quartet, which is in 4 movements and very much in the style of quartets that he knew about then from German composers. He began to break away and began to create a music that was so unfamiliar to everybody that it took some getting used to. And when I say unfamiliar, I mean, I think there are composers like Bach and Mozart who grab every bit of existing music available to them and do it better. Debussy went a different path. He had completely different idea about what music should be. And there really is no antecedent for Debussy's music. Where does it come from? It comes from one person's imagination. And when we get used to that and we listen to it, then it seems, like it was always there. But when you think about Debussy, actually, it wasn't there. It was really his imagination that led us in that direction. Life wasn't kind to Debussy. In 1909, he was diagnosed with cancer. And the treatment of cancer has always been complicated, and it didn't go very well with him. And he was kind of burned out. He didn't have energy, and he kind of stopped composing mostly for a while. And then another thing that was very, very upsetting to him and to the French was the First World War, which started in 1914. Debussy had a publisher named Durand, and Durand, who saw that Debussy wasn't writing anything, came to him around 1914 or 15 and said, I have an idea for you. I want you to write some more music. He was commissioned to write 6 sonatas for various instruments. On the title page, 6 sonatas dedicated to his late wife. And also on that page, he wrote the word musicien français, French musician, in which he was saying, I am not German. I am not writing that kind of music. And he wasn't anyway by then, but it was an act in the time of war of national pride. So he set out, and he managed, before his untimely death 3 years later from that cancer, to complete only 3 of the 6 planned sonatas. They were intending so that the 6th sonata in the plan would assemble all of the instruments of all 5 preceding it into one piece. That piece never was written. So we're going to talk one by one about the 3 pieces. The first one he wrote was in 1915, and it was written for cello and piano. It's a very interesting piece. It's not terribly long. It's about 12 minutes long. It is in 3 movements, and you cannot really say, although he calls it a sonata, that it doesn't sound like a sonata by Beethoven or Brahms or Schumann or any of the great composers preceding him. It is definitely 3 sections, but not like them at all. He was reaching out to all different kinds of sounds. He was interested in sounds from various countries of Europe, especially the Mediterranean countries. He was interested in the music of Asia. And in the cello sonata, we get a taste of that. The idea behind the piece, even though he didn't precisely say so, comes from the Italian tradition of commedia dell'arte, the art comedy, which came into fruition in the 15th and 16th centuries in the northern part of Italy, in Florence and Bergamo. And the art comedy was a little bit like those shows you see on television that are in series. So you know that next week it's the same people come together and something else happens to them. In the commedia dell'arte, you had stock figures. The one that's most interesting for this sonata was named Pierrot. Pierrot was the young man who was always falling in love when it was a full moon. And there were various other characters. One was a clown, one was an older man, and one was a beautiful girl. And Pierrot, for all his falling in love with them, always those stories ended that he never got the girl. So the piece begins with the sun going up, and then it almost immediately turns into something with moonlight. And this first movement, which is very compact, has lots of things, and in one middle part of it has something that becomes like a storm at sea, like you have in La Mer. It's a very condensed movement and ends quietly. Then in the second movement, Pierrot comes into his own. It's a serenade. And he tunes his guitar, and off he goes. And every time he approaches the girl, she says no. Increasingly, he gets desperate. She says no even more decisively, until finally, at the very end of this short movement, with changes all of the time, he gives up. The church bells ring, and he goes on to having fun, going to a village fair or something like that. That's basically the story of this piece. So the next piece I'm going to talk about is the next one he wrote, the same year as the cello sonata, 1915. And it's going to be last on our program, but I want to talk about them in the order in which they were written. It's a trio for flute, viola, and harp. Debussy thought the third instrument was going to be the clarinet. And he dropped that idea and chose the viola, as he thought it would make a more interesting mix of pizzicatos, pluck notes on the viola and pluck notes on the harp that he thought that would be more interesting. And again, because these pieces are so popular, I don't have to tell you play by play what's going on because we know it. And also, this is a very atmospheric piece. It's pretty hard to categorize what's happening when. And I think the best way to give you a feel for it is to read his words from a letter that he wrote to a friend after it was written. The sound of it is not bad, though it is not for me to speak to you of the music. I could do so, however, without embarrassment, for it is the music of a Debussy whom I no longer know. That means he's changed a lot. And he finishes by saying, it is frightfully mournful, and I don't know whether one should laugh or cry. Perhaps both? Obviously very invested in it. The last thing to tell you about this piece is that this is a really amazing thing to share. The very first performance of this piece anywhere in the world took place right here in Jordan Hall on November 7th, 1916. There's a story behind that, and I'll leave that for another day, but let's move on now to talk about the last piece he wrote. So the very last piece that Debussy wrote in his life and completed was the Sonata for violin and piano. That was written in 1917. He actually played the first performance of it. He was very sick already, but that happened. And it has source material from a lot of different cultures. And the one that's most interesting maybe to mention is, like a lot of composers of his time in not just France, but in other countries, they were very, very caught up in interest of American jazz. I've in past First Mondays programmed music of the American jazz players and composers who came to Paris and really in the early part of that period were very active in France. But I'm not talking about that right now. I just want to say that when you listen to this piece and you hear some things that sound like his piano piece, Golliwogg's Cakewalk, that there is some sense of this jazz element in the violin sonata. It's again a very compact piece. And yet, it's very hard to grab a hold of it and say, this is exactly what it is. So, as I did with the trio sonata, I'm going to give the composer the last word. Here's what he said. You should know, my too trusting friend, that I only wrote this sonata to be rid of the thing, spurred on as I was by my dear publisher. You who are able to read between the staves, between the lines, will see traces of Edgar Allan Poe's The Imp of the Perverse in this piece, who encourages one to choose the very subject which should be ignored. Interesting. This sonata, Debussy goes on to say, will be interesting from a documentary viewpoint and as an example of what may be produced by a sick man in time of war.